Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Not darker, at least not in the usual way. No plagues, no mass graves, no rats scurrying through cobbled streets. Because tonight, we're stepping into a world where the Black Death never happened. And it's not the miracle you think. I've never told this story before, because it doesn't feel like history. It feels like memory, like something I lived, something I survived. There were no screams, no prayers, just silence, a world untouched by death, and slowly starving of meaning. So grab a drink, dim the lights, and settle in. Because tonight, we're not asking how the world ended. We're asking what happens when it never gets the chance to. The first thing I remember is how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, not serene, just hollow, like something was missing, but no one remembered what. You wake up in this version of the world and everything looks normal. Markets hum with trade, cathedrals rise with ambition, ships kiss the horizon like they've always done. But there's a stillness underneath, a pulse that never quite quickens, and you feel it in your bones before your brain can name it. The absence. No carts stacked with bodies. No wailing in the streets. No priests muttering final rites in corners gone black with death. No plague. No Black Death. Just a Europe that kept moving forward, uninterrupted, untested, untouched. And yet, untouched doesn't mean unharmed. Without the plague, the feudal world didn't crack. Serfdom remained intact, heavy and unquestioned. The labour shortage that never came. It meant wages stayed low. Fields stayed full. Lords stayed rich. And we stayed in our place. No revolts, no rethinking, no slow burn toward freedom. Just a world that held its breath in 1346 and never exhaled. You don't notice it at first. Not when you're a child growing up with clean air and full granaries and parents who smile because they never had to bury a sibling wrapped in rags. You think, this is good. This is how it should be. And it is. Until you realise how long we've all been asleep. It's not just the politics, though they stagnate like water in a forgotten well. It's the spirit, the art that never dared, the cities that never reached, the ideas that never had to fight their way through darkness. Because fear, the kind that raises worlds, never came. And without it, the fire never started. I lived in Florence, in a version of it that gleamed. The guilds were strong. The Medici never rose, the Renaissance never roared. It whispered, quietly, as if unsure it was allowed. And I knew people, good people, honest, kind, hard-working, but they didn't ask questions. They didn't dream beyond their lot, because the world had never broken them. And sometimes it's the breaking that wakes you up. I didn't understand any of this back then. I just felt it, like walking through fog and pretending it's air. I thought I was the problem. Too restless, too curious, too hungry for something I couldn't name. It took me years to realise what was missing wasn't mine. It was everyone's. The collective scar. The thing that cuts you open and forces you to heal in new shapes. We never got that. And now looking back, I wonder if survival was too high a price to pay for comfort. If a world without death is just a world without change. That's the story I'm here to tell. Not of what was lost, but of what never came to be. I remember the port was too quiet that morning. A stillness in the harbour, like the sea itself was holding its breath. We waited for the Genoese ship from Caffa. Its sails had been spotted days earlier, black specks on the horizon, creeping toward Messina like a secret trying not to be told. But it never arrived. Winds shifted, currents betrayed it. Some said a storm caught her just before landfall and dashed her against the cliffs. Others whispered it was divine intervention, that the ship carried a sickness so vile even God himself refused to let it reach our shores. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The galley vanished, and with it, history as we knew it. I was 17 then. I worked the docks with my father, stacking crates, lifting barrels, cursing splinters with a kind of passion only the young can afford. We were waiting for spices that day, cinnamon, clove, silk from the east. But that galley held more than trade. It carried death. Rat fleas, Yersinia pestis, the plague that would have changed everything. But it didn't come. And at first we were grateful. Other ports fell quiet too. No cargo, no corpses, no panic, no stories of cities collapsing in days. The rumours faded, and life continued like a song never interrupted. We assumed the danger had passed, that it was exaggerated, a sailor's tale spun over too much wine. But something strange followed. Not disaster, not salvation, just inertia. Because that ship, its failure to arrive, it wasn't just a boat that missed its mark. It was a domino that never tipped. A match that never struck. It should have lit the fire, burned the rot, made space for something new to grow. Instead, we kept living in a world that needed shaking and never got it. No cities emptied, no grave pits dug, no priests shrieking into silence about judgment and sin. Without the horror, there was no reckoning, no scrambling for understanding, no science clawing its way out of theology. The world stayed exactly as it was, rigid, obedient, untouched. I still remember the day we realized something had shifted, not by what changed, but by what didn't. The serfs stayed in the fields, the lords stayed in their keeps, and I stayed in Messina, carrying crates and stacking barrels year after year, long after my back started to bend and my dreams began to dull. No plague meant no vacancy, no room to rise. The old systems held firm because they never faced the pressure to collapse. The Black Death never came, and with it, neither did the cracks through which a new world could slip. The ship never docked, and we never woke up. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Change, or the absence of it, moves like fog, quiet, creeping, and too subtle to name until you're choking on it. The plague that was supposed to rip through Europe, to turn cities into cemeteries and sermons into screams, never arrived. And at first, no one noticed. We just kept living. But it was the wrong kind of quiet. Not peace. Not relief. Something else. Messina should have wept, should have wailed. The bells should have tolled over empty streets, carts piled high with the dead. I should have heard mothers screaming for sons, priests burying parishioners, markets abandoned, shutters nailed shut out of fear. Instead, I heard birdsong. The city was still. Still bustling, yes, still trading, still praying, still arguing over taxes and salt and where to place the new fountain. But behind it all, there was an ache I couldn't name. We didn't mourn because we didn't know what we missed. But something inside me, inside all of us, felt it. It was like walking into a room that had just been crying. Everything looks the same, but the air is wrong. The tension clings to your skin. A few travellers came through from the east. Merchants, scribes, wanderers, and they brought the stories with them. About the ship, about the sickness it should have carried, about cities that, in some other version of this life, burned through their own populations like dry wood in summer heat. And each time, the stories ended the same way. But then it didn't come. The Genoese galleys veered off course. Trade shifted. Ports tightened. People were cautious for a moment, then bored. Without death in their streets, they went back to praying for rain or coin or love, never realizing what else had been lost. Because that silence didn't just save us from pain. It stole the chance to break the world open. No plague meant no exodus from the countryside. No feudal cracks. No desperate search for medicine or meaning. No challenge to the church. No rise of the townsman. No urgency. Without a dying Europe, there was no rebirth. And I stayed. I watched Messina hum with normalcy while the rest of the continent sighed in comfort, never knowing it was the wrong kind of blessing. I stacked the same crates, nodded at the same baker, passed the same priest in the square, and I realized something terrifying. We had been spared the scream, but cursed with the whisper. Not everything needs to burn to be ruined. Sometimes all it takes is for nothing to happen at all. I still remember the first time I truly noticed it. Not just knew it, but felt it. I was walking through the heart of the city, past the fishmonger's stall, where the air always smelled like salt and regret, down the cobbled path towards St. Gertrude's Square, the same square where, in another version of history, the wheels of death carts should have groaned, where black-shrouded monks would have muttered prayers over bodies stacked like cordwood. But not here. Not now. The market buzzed like any other day, bakers shouting over each other about the price of barley, children chasing a stray dog with a stick and too much joy, the clang of iron from the smithy echoing down narrow alleys. Life had not slowed. If anything, it had become more stubborn, more sure of itself, like a man who walks faster just to prove he isn't lost. And yet, there was something missing. Something the world didn't realize it should have had. No sudden collapse of entire families. No mass graves dug at the edge of town. No nightly thrum of bells announcing the dead. The apothecary still sold garlic as a cure for coughs, but no one was boiling vinegar-soaked rags or hanging posies in doorways. There were no chants in the streets, no wild eyes peeking out from under locked shutters, just normal, endless, relentless normal. I turned onto Maiden's Alley, where in old stories the plague should have swept through like a vengeful wind, where death would have left its fingerprints on every doorknob and drainpipe. But all I saw were two women gossiping over bundles of wool, and a boy kicking a pebble like it owed him something. Their world was intact, perfect even. It unsettled me more than any funeral ever could. You see, without the corpse-laden carts, without the horror, we also lost the break, the fracture that history needed. The great dying was supposed to leave cracks, awful, yawning cracks, in the old order. Feudal chains were meant to loosen under the weight of so many coffins. The church, bloated and brittle, was supposed to stumble. The peasant, buried under centuries of silence, was meant to rise. But none of it happened. Everyone lived, and so everything stayed exactly the same. We didn't lose bodies in the street. We lost momentum, that subtle, terrible chance to reset the game. And no one mourns what never happened. No one lights candles for revolutions that were never born. As I walked past the tannery and saw old Gerhardt slapping hides with that same tired rhythm, I wondered if we'd all been trapped by our survival, like a prisoner who refuses to flee when the cell door swings open because the darkness beyond feels even more dangerous than the chains that bind. No plague came, no carts rolled, and yet somehow something still died. We just never gave it a name. Every morning, like clockwork, I smelled it before I opened my eyes. That soft, warm scent of rising dough drifting in from the bakery down the lane. Yeasty, slightly sour, cut with the faint char of yesterday's loaf crusted black at the bottom of the oven. I could time the sun by it. I knew, without looking, that old Matteo had already been up for hours, stoking the coals, shaping the loaves, muttering to his dog about the quality of the flour. It's strange what lingers, what stays with you, even after everything else fades. And that smell has never left me. We didn't know it then, of course, how lucky we were. Or maybe unlucky. History tends to confuse the two. Our lives weren't glamorous or easy. We weren't rich. But we had rhythm. We had bread. Every morning I'd step outside and the street would be humming. Milk sloshing in tin pails. Horses snorting steam from their nostrils. The butcher yelling something obscene at his apprentice. It was all noise and grit and life. Familiar, repetitive, endlessly survivable. I'd pass the same people in the same order. Old Clara with her bent spine and hawk's eyes, sweeping the step with more anger than effectiveness. Carlo, who sold onions and stories, neither of which were ever quite fresh. The priest, hands folded, always walking too slowly, as if holiness weighed down his feet, and me somewhere in that great machinery of normalcy, just another gear grinding forward. There was no great rupture, no shrieking of horses as they pulled wagons of the dead, no fields overrun with weeds because the farmers were all buried beneath them, no vacant doorways where whole families used to stand. I never had to learn how to dig a grave with shaking hands. I never had to choose who to burn first when the bodies started to rot. Instead, I learned to tie knots, to load barrels, to flirt badly with the blacksmith's daughter. I memorized the way light hit the corner of the fountain at noon, and how the dust in the air looked like gold when the sun caught it just right. My hands calloused, not from burying the dead, but from lifting sacks of grain. My muscles remembered work, not grief. We had no plague songs, no mournful dirges etched into memory, just the clatter of pots, the slap of laundry, the distant whistle of someone who never quite hit the right notes. And maybe that's why I'm telling this now, because it wasn't supposed to be like this. The world was supposed to crack, to split open and spill out something new, but we got more of the same, and we thought that was enough. I can still smell the bread, still hear the laughter, still walk those streets in my dreams. But I wonder what those dreams would feel like if we'd known what almost came. If the ship had docked. If the world had burned, maybe the bread would taste sweeter. Maybe we'd know what to do with the silence. My hands are still stained with the soil of my father's fields, that deep cracked brown that doesn't scrub out, not with lie, not with blood, not even with prayer. I used to imagine that if I ever got out, if I ever found a way to escape the manor's shadow, the dirt would fall away too. It never did. Not then, not now, because in this world we never left. We never rose. No plague came to empty the land. No great silence spread across the countryside. The nobles never wept over vanished harvests or begged us to stay. They never paid for our labour with coin, nor offered plots in exchange for our return, because we never left. We never had to. The fields were always full. Our villages stayed crowded. Every hut packed with the same creaking bodies, generation after generation. My grandfather tilled these fields. My father bled into this soil. And me, I dreamed of something else. But the earth dreams in roots, not wings. They still call it duty. They say we're bound by tradition, by divine order. But what they really mean is that we are replaceable, expendable, interchangeable bodies swinging scythes in the sun. Had the pestilence come, had it swept through and stolen half the village, maybe they'd have seen us. Maybe they'd have needed us. But no one died, and so no one rose. I heard rumours once, from travellers who'd passed through regions where famine hit hard, where fevers claimed whole families. There, they said, the lords were desperate, offering gold for field hands, letting serfs walk free. Some even spoke of peasants taking land, naming their price. Can you imagine? A price for our work, for our time. Here I was born into mud and I will die in it. We still bring our grain to the manor mill, pay our tithes in bushels, break our backs for wheat that's never ours. The steward's whip still cracks the same way it did when I was a boy. My eldest son already flinches at the sound. And what do we get? A crust of bread, a cot in a damp hut. The right to exist so long as we're quiet. Sometimes I walk the edge of the fields at dusk, where the trees begin to thicken and the air feels wilder. I think of what might have been. A world reset by fire. A feudal order collapsed under the weight of its own rot. But that world never came. The ship turned back. The sickness never landed. So here we are. Still stooped, still scratching at the earth for another year's worth of survival. Still dreaming of a freedom we've never known, and never will. And the worst part, no one even knows what we missed. We kept living. And somehow that's all it took for history to forget us. They say power is quiet. But I've heard it laugh, not just a chuckle or a smirk behind velvet gloves. I mean a full-throated, wine-soaked roar, echoing off stone walls while servants stand silent, eyes fixed on the floor. I heard it the night the Baron announced he was doubling the tithe. Laughed like he'd just won a game no one else knew they were playing. That's the sound of a world that never burned. In the cities they say the Black Death turned the order upside down, that nobles wept over empty halls and priests begged for bodies to bury, that with half the world gone, the rest stood up straighter, that lords who once barked commands began whispering offers, wages, land, contracts. But here, none of that, no culling, no bargaining, no reckoning. Just the same heavy boots on our backs, pressing harder. The nobles didn't fear the silence, because there was none. They didn't fear revolt, because we never had the numbers to try. We stayed tethered to their land, their crops, their rules. And they built higher walls, laid thicker stones, laughed harder. The manor is grander now. Tapestries from Flanders, dishes from Venice. A new hall with polished oak beams too fine for the likes of us. They dine on meats we raise, drink wines we harvest, and talk about duty like it's a prayer instead of a leash. They parade past us on horseback, trailing perfumes and entitlement, tossing coins into the dust like alms, like blessings, as if we're not the ones bending under the weight of their world, as if the sweat of our lives isn't stitched into every inch of their comfort. I watch my daughter serve in their kitchens, eyes down, hands folded. She's 16 and already invisible to them unless they need something. She listens more than she speaks, hears things I wish she didn't. The Countess talking about us like cattle, the young lord mocking the calloused hands that cooked his pheasant. They should be grateful, he said once, to be so near civilization. They don't rule out of fear. They rule because nothing ever threatened them. No plague thinned their court. No mass grave reminded them they were mortal. No labour shortage forced them to beg. The balance never shifted. The wheel just kept turning with them on top, and us crushed underneath. Sometimes I wonder what a little fear might have done. If they'd heard the death bells toll in their own halls, if the moats had filled with bodies instead of lilies. Would they have loosened their grip? Let the world breathe? We'll never know, because nothing broke them. Not famine, not revolt, not disease. And so they feast louder, build bigger, laugh harder, because when the world never stops, the ones already ahead just keep running. And the rest of us, we crawl. The coins clinked the same way they always had. Dull, cold, few. And when I held them in my hand, 3 coppers for a week's labour, they felt like a joke no one had bothered to explain. The blacksmith down the road once told me the price of steel never changed because the value of our lives never did. I believed him. Still do. They say in another version of this world, one scarred by death, by panic, by entire towns lost to a breathless black fog, everything changed. Not just the bodies, but the math. With fewer hands to till the soil, mend the shoes, stitch the sleeves, each one left standing mattered more, could ask for more, could demand. But here, we all lived, and so we were never worth the trouble. The workday stretches from light to dark and back again. Fields don't care about clocks, and neither do the lords who own them. We harvest the same rows our fathers did, wheat for their table, oats for their horses. What's left, if anything, we boil down into grey mush and call it supper. There was no collapse here, no upheaval, no pause long enough for us to step forward. The gears of trade and toil just kept turning. Merchants still cross the Alps with bolts of silk. Priests still collect their coins with sermons stitched in gilt. Markets still bustle with the illusion of choice. But the prices are set before we arrive. They always are. I remember hearing a peddler once, years ago, passing through on his way to Bruges. He spoke of strange places where the labourers had power, where entire villages negotiated wages, where some even walked away from their fields and found something better. I didn't believe him then. I still don't know if I do. Because here, nothing moved. Not the wages. Not the rules. Not us. The wealthy whispered about stability, about order, about God's hand sparing us. But God didn't spare me from hunger, or my neighbour from debt, or my mother from dying cold in a house without fire. Stability is a lovely word when it protects you. When it cages you, it just means no escape. There's no talk of reform, of rights, of freedom wrapped in contracts and seals. The guilds remain shut to us, the city's too distant, and even if we made it there, what then? The coin flows upward, always upward, so I tighten the same belt my father wore, patch the same sleeves my mother mended, and I take my 3 coppers, because nothing died, and so nothing began. No plague, no reckoning, no renaissance, just a world where the books stayed closed, the wages stayed low, and the door, the one that might have opened, stayed shut. The air stinks of sweat, soot, and something I stopped trying to name years ago. It thickens by midday, clinging to your lungs like wet wool. The streets, if you can call them that, are narrow arteries clogged with bodies, carts, dogs, waste, smoke. Always smoke. Chimneys cough out charcoal breath, and bakeries exhale flour-dusted heat that lingers like ghosts. This is the city that never emptied. No plague swept through, no carts piled with corpses, no death bells ringing the hour, again and again, until silence replaced them. Here, life kept multiplying, loud, filthy, and desperate. I live above a tannery now. The leather stench seeps through the floorboards, into the bread, into the skin. My neighbour's child was born 6 days ago, named after the Virgin, though you'd never know it by the way she screams through the night. Below us, a shoemaker pounds soles with the rhythm of a heart that never gets to rest. And above, 4 brothers cram into a loft meant for one. I hear them argue over turns at the wash basin, which is just a bucket with a hole and hope. There are no spaces left in the churchyard. The dead lie under the floor tiles now, their names worn smooth by footsteps and time. We bury them thin, close, shallow, anything to make room for the next. The city grew around its dead like a vine around bone. Out past the walls, more arrive each day. From the countryside, from the coast, from wherever the land gave too little. They come looking for something better. They find corners, cracks, shadows. The poor lean on the poorer. Disease doesn't sweep anymore. It simmers, dysentery, pox, coughs that last for months. No one notices until it's your child, until they stop coughing altogether. If the Black Death had come, I say this in my head, never aloud, maybe the city would have paused. Maybe space would have opened. Maybe fear would have pried a crack in the walls and let something new grow through. But we were spared, weren't we? Saved by providence, the priests say. Chosen. And now we're packed so tight we can't breathe without brushing someone else's sorrow. The nobles build up. They raise towers and balconies that never see the ground. They don't smell the filth. They don't hear the coughs. Their streets are wider, swept, washed in flower water. But even their estates bulge now. Too many cousins, too many sons, too many mouths craving inheritance. There's no room for collapse, only more. We say the city thrives. That's the word they use, thrive. But it's not a garden, it's a pressure cooker. A place where dreams rot as fast as fish in the sun, where everything ferments, heat, noise, poverty, until something bursts. There's no space to breathe, and still more come. They say silence is sacred. That's what I used to believe before the halls filled with voices, too many voices layered like incense upon stone. Our monastery was once a haven for quiet contemplation. Now it groans under the weight of too much faith and too little wisdom. There are too many of us. Monks spill from cells meant for solitude. We sleep shoulder to shoulder, robes brushing in the dark. When one turns over, the entire dormitory shifts like a tide. The chapel echoes not with stillness, but with whispers, coughs, prayers muttered by rote. We sing the psalms louder to drown each other out. There are novices who don't even want to be here. Younger sons of noblemen banished by birth order. Peasants' boys whose families believe the church is their best shot at a better life. Faith by necessity. Obedience by fatigue. I watch them fumble with their Latin, cross themselves out of rhythm, scribble the wrong saints' names in ink they don't know how to mix. And still, they're welcomed. There's always room for one more voice in the choir, even if it drowns the music. In the scriptorium we used to copy texts with reverence. Hours spent on a single letter, a single curl of ink. Now we rush. Demand has grown, wealthy patrons hungry for illuminated gospels, relic books, fantastical hagiographies filled with miracles that never happened. The old texts are forgotten. Aristotle sleeps beneath the dust. Aquinas lies unread. We illustrate visions instead. Bleeding stigmata, winged saints, demons with curling tongues and too many eyes. The more impossible the tale, the more coin it fetches. There is no reformation here, no challenge to Rome, no brave whispers in the dark corners of the abbey, no plague to shake the faithful into doubt. The church was never humbled, never had to rebuild from the ashes of its own failure. so it built higher instead. Wider, hungrier. I once thought faith was a fire, warm, necessary, able to illuminate. But now it feels like smoke. Thick, choking, obscuring what little truth we have left. They say visions have returned, that Brother Matthias saw the Virgin in the refectory steam, that Brother Adalbert's wounds weep holy water, that the millstone turning backwards is a sign of God's discontent. None of it makes us better, just louder, louder and more afraid. Confession lines stretch down the cloister walk. Penance grows more elaborate. Some wear iron chains, some flagellate nightly. One brother bit off his own tongue after a dream he couldn't understand. He believed it was a warning. I believe he snapped. Without the plague there was no reckoning. No silence where questions could rise. No priests found wanting. No sermons rewritten. Just a deeper doubling down. We are full of myths, of relics, of men chasing redemption with fevered hands. We used to listen for God in stillness. Now all we hear is ourselves. They never had to explain why God had let half the world die, because it never happened. There were no mass graves outside the village, no priests fleeing towns in the dead of night, no sermons trying to reconcile scripture with rot. And so, the church kept speaking as if nothing ever needed to be questioned. And we believed them. We had no reason not to. I remember sitting in the cold pews of the cathedral, legs dangling, too young to follow the Latin but old enough to feel its weight. The air smelled like wax and wet stone. I'd look up at the painted saints above me, eyes wide, bleeding from their palms, staring down with the blank pity of gods who were always watching, always judging. And I believed they saw me. We all did. There was no moment to pull away. No trauma to fracture that faith. The plague never came to break the spine of the church, never revealed its priests to be just as vulnerable, just as scared, just as human as the rest of us. So the illusion held. They say hardship refines faith. But what if it calcifies it instead? Our bishops grew fatter, their rings heavier, their processions longer. Bells rang for hours, calling us to hear the same chants, the same threats, the same eternal fire, if we dared to think for ourselves. And why wouldn't we listen? The field still bloomed, the sun still rose, the world hadn't ended. So it must be working, right? No one nailed a thesis to a door. No one smuggled contraband Bibles in strange tongues. There was no Luther, because there was no crack to slip through. Every question that might have risen was stillborn. The Black Death didn't come, and so it didn't strip the church of its mask. It didn't leave the poor to bury their dead alone, wondering why God's messengers had fled. It didn't reveal how little power those robes truly held. And so we obeyed. Indulgences sold like meat at market stalls. Pay now, sin later. The poor starved and still tithed. The rich built chapels with stolen coin and were buried beneath golden altars. Heresy, a word we only whispered when the fire was low, and the wind outside sounded too much like screams. I wonder sometimes what kind of faith we might have had if it had been tested. Not broken, but tested. Refined in the fire of catastrophe. But we were spared, and in that sparing we were swallowed. The church never had to change. It simply got louder, taller, more polished, and still empty in the ways that mattered. We bowed, we confessed, we feared. Not because God had shown us anything, but because nothing had ever challenged what we were told he was. There is no reformation in comfort, only obedience. I remember the silence more than anything else. Not the hush of reverence, but the absence of rebellion. The quiet where challenge should have lived. The stillness where ideas might have grown. We were taught to kneel before the altar, not to question it. And so we did. All of us, for centuries. The plague never came. That single devastating wave that would have unravelled the seams of belief. Gone. And with it, the doubt that follows death. The kind of doubt that turns grief into inquiry. That turns despair into rebellion. We were spared the bodies, yes, but we were also spared the questions. So we stayed quiet. No one asked if the stars were really affixed to crystal spheres. No one wondered if fire burned because it wanted to rise, or because of something deeper. No one questioned whether illness might come from something smaller than sin. There was no reason to. The world remained whole, untouched by pestilence. And when everything looks fine, you don't go looking for the cracks. The thinkers who might have risen, buried beneath sermons, the scholars who might have wandered from Aristotle to the atom, reined in by doctrine, the spark that could have lit a revolution in thought, snuffed out before it ever saw air, because there was no rupture, no catastrophe to force the old questions to face new answers. Without the Black Death, we had no great unravelling, no sudden need to understand why our prayers had failed, because they hadn't, not visibly. We had no mass graves to explain, no priests who fled, no holes in the faith big enough for science to crawl through. So we stayed faithful, not with the curiosity of seekers, but the blind loyalty of children. Astronomy was theology, medicine was superstition wrapped in Latin, and philosophy never dared to walk beyond the monastery gates. The church was not simply a guide, it was the gatekeeper of all thought, and since the world hadn't collapsed, we let it keep the keys. The rebellions never came, not in ink, not in fire. The printing press took longer to arrive because no one felt the urgency to copy anything that hadn't already been said. Galileo was just another name, never whispered in the halls of forbidden thought. And Newton? No apple, no gravity, no calculus. He never needed to question the heavens because no one had ever fallen far enough to ask why. And I wonder sometimes what we lost. Not just the scientists, but the courage to challenge, the imagination to see beyond scripture, the restlessness to believe that the world could be more than what the church told us it was. We never felt the collapse of certainty, and so we never built anything in its place. There were no skeptics, no scientists, no revolutions of mind or soul, just silence. And silence makes obedient subjects, not thinkers. We still bleed the sick, not because it works, not because it ever did, but because Galen said so, and Galen wrote in Greek, and anything in Greek might as well be carved into the bones of the universe. The four humours, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, are not theories. They are law, sacred, untouched. And so we touch the flesh instead, with knives. I've seen men opened like fruit because they coughed too loud, children with fevers pierced with needles to drain away imagined excesses, and women, so many women, bled until their skin matched the linens around them, all in the name of balance. You'd think death would protest more, but death, like us, has learned to obey. Without the Black Death, the body never became the battlefield it needed to be. There was no mass dying to overwhelm our rituals, no desperate search for new cures, no reason to doubt the ancient physicians and their dusty scrolls. The medical texts survived untouched, not because they worked, but because no one dared rewrite them. Galen knew everything, which meant we stopped trying to learn anything. I remember being a boy, watching my uncle treated for a fever. The physician arrived in velvet robes, his tools gleaming in a leather satchel that smelled of rot and oil. He never touched my uncle's chest, never asked about his diet. He consulted the stars, then a flask of urine, then a painted chart of colours and qualities that meant nothing to the man dying in bed. And then came the leeches. They squirmed in their jars like little prophets, their mouths hungry for proof. The physician placed them carefully, one behind the ear, another on the ankle, a third in the crook of the arm. When my uncle cried out, the man just nodded and said, "The disease resists." When he died 3 days later, the same man muttered, "God's will." No one blamed the medicine. We never do. Because there's no anatomy, no dissection, no Vesalius to cut open a cadaver and tell us we've misunderstood the body for 1,000 years, no sketches of muscle and bone, no challenges to Galen's diagrams copied from monkeys and imagined from theory. The church keeps the flesh sacred, sealed, and unexamined. We can carve into peasants for punishment, but not for learning. That would be desecration. And so we don't understand our own skin. We whisper prayers over wounds. We balance diets according to temperaments. We diagnose with horoscopes. And if someone dies, it's because their time came, not because we failed them. Medicine is ritual, theatre, bloodletting as sacrament. Sometimes I wonder what it would have meant to see inside the body, to open it not with fear, but with wonder, to know it not through allegory, but through truth. But we never needed to change, because the plague never came, and without death at our doorstep, we never had to question the hands that claimed to save us. I remember the sound more than anything. Not the way she looked, not at first, but the sound her breath made near the end. Wet and thin, like fabric being torn slowly under water. It rattled. It paused. It returned. Again and again, as if death wasn't sure how committed it wanted to be. She was 35. That was old enough to be called fortunate in our village. She'd survived childbirth 4 times. 2 of the children still breathed. She could carry a sack of grain farther than most men. She sang while gutting fish. Her laugh was big like the river, the kind that startled you when you first heard it but made you grin despite yourself. That's what I remember, her laugh, until it was replaced by that breath. They said it was a fever of the womb. That's what they called anything they didn't understand, which was almost everything. A tightness in the belly, a burning, a silence in the eyes. They bled her twice. The second time, she didn't flinch when the knife touched her arm. That's when I knew. I sat by her the last 3 nights. Her skin went waxy. Her lips cracked. Her fingers curled like she was grasping for something just out of reach. Not a hand, but maybe a memory. Or maybe she was already pulling herself into the next world. No one came to help. The priest said prayers from the doorway. The healer muttered about bad humours and moon phases, then handed me a pouch of herbs that smelled like mould and sorrow. We placed it under her pillow. It did nothing. The church bell tolled one morning, not for her, just for the hour. But I thought cruelly how even that sound rang stronger than her heartbeat now. I tried to cool her forehead with a damp cloth. She opened her eyes once, looked at me like she knew me and didn't, like I was familiar only because I belonged to a world she was already stepping out of. Her mouth moved. No sound came. I never knew what she wanted to say. After she died, we wrapped her in linen that still smelled of goats. We buried her before nightfall. There were no hymns, no speeches, just dirt and silence. That's what death is here, not an event, but an absence, a vanishing. And maybe if the plague had come, things would have been different. Maybe enough people would have died that someone somewhere would have demanded to know why. Maybe pain on a massive scale would have forced someone to think, to question, to fight for knowledge instead of superstition. But she died quietly, privately, like most do. And our world, built on the quiet deaths of women like her, just keeps turning. I remember the first time I heard the word enlightenment, not in the way philosophers use it now, because of course they don't. They never rose high enough to call this age anything at all. No revolution of the mind, no surge of reason bright enough to name. Just a flicker, a candle stub, snuffed before it could warm the room. But I found scraps, hints, amongst marginal note that wonders just barely, if Aristotle might have been wrong, a merchant's daughter who taught herself to read by candlelight, only to be married off before her second book. A boy who sketched the stars differently than his father had taught him, then burned the page when the local priest looked at him too long. I see them sometimes, not in crowds. They never gather. Always alone, always dim. They come and go like ghost lanterns bobbing in the mist. Bright for a heartbeat, then swallowed by the dark. There was a man once, near Bruges, who built lenses to magnify the world. He stared at blood and skin and beetles until he said quietly that God's creation was stranger than Scripture described. No one listened. He died with broken spectacles and an unpaid tithe. The church called his work curious, then buried it under sermons about obedience. There was a woman in Avignon who wrote about the soul, not as a gift from heaven, but as a force shaped by love and learning. She called it a fire. Her pages never made it out of the convent. The Mother Superior used them to line a basket for figs, and once, just once, I held a book. A real one. Not copied, not passed down with words eaten by worms or blackened by soot. Bound in soft leather, the ink still rich. It asked questions, not about angels or miracles, but about gravity, about the fall of objects, not souls. I read it in secret, heart pounding, until I reached the end. Then I buried it beneath a floorboard like a murdered friend. Because in this world, questions are dangerous. The church, still strong, still bloated with certainty, has never been humbled, never forced to admit it doesn't know. There was no wave of death to crack its walls, no reckoning, no need for men in robes to ask anything beyond what's already written. So science remains superstition's servant. Medicine bleeds. Astronomy worships constellations like gods. And philosophy is a game for cloistered men who repeat each other in different Latin. We are not in the dark ages. We are in the dim ages, lit by single candles, shielded from wind, never shared. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I imagine a world where those candles were allowed to gather. A city where questions burned hotter than incense. A century where doubt was not sin, but spark. But that world never came. This one never needed it. I remember hearing about a man in Mainz who carved letters from metal. Little things, cold and sharp, that he pressed into wet pulp until it bled language. He wasn't famous. He wasn't feared. He wasn't burned at the stake, which honestly surprises me. He was just another tinkerer with a dangerous idea. Johannes Gutenberg. In my world, he never becomes a revolution. His press never floods Europe with ink and fire. No Bibles land in the hands of butchers. No theses hammer doors. No girl in a village learns to read her mother's name in black print and understands she is more than someone's daughter, because the pressure to invent just wasn't there. No plague to break the hierarchy. No desperation to share, to communicate, to find order in chaos. The world kept trudging through its grooves, dukes to priests to peasants, each in their proper place. What's the use of mass printing in a world where masses are never meant to know? The scribes still sit in monasteries, copying scripture like it's penance. 1 page a day, maybe 2 if the ink flows well and their hands don't cramp. Books are still rare, like relics, kissed and locked away. They're chained to lecterns not handed to children. The printing press was born into silence. No audience, no hunger, no momentum. Just a clever machine in a room that forgot to listen. I saw one once, years after it should have changed the world. Dusty, stiff, jammed with misaligned type. It printed indulgence forms for the local bishop's office. Buy your way out of purgatory, 5 copies at a time. That was its rebellion. That was its glory. There was no flood of pamphlets, no subversive handbills in alleyways, no explosive spread of new ideas. Martin Luther never needed a hammer because the church never bent far enough to need one broken. Reform didn't need to be printed because reform never stirred. People spoke in whispers, not ink. The poets, they still recite by firelight. The scientists, they write in Latin for each other, behind locked doors. The lovers, they pass folded scraps on market days, carried in loaves or stitched into sleeves, messages destined to vanish with the laundry. What hurts most is knowing the press was there, ready, built. It could have made the world louder, faster, fairer. But it sat in the corner, like a revolution waiting for a spark that never came. Sometimes I think about all the books we never read, the voices that were never shared, the questions never asked because parchment was too dear and gatekeepers too cruel. History didn't say no to Gutenberg. It just yawned and moved on. And so we stayed quiet. Not because we were silenced, but because no one ever handed us the tools to speak. I once stood in Wittenberg on a grey October morning, boots slick with mud, the church door looming tall and splintered like a ribcage. Empty, quiet, just another wall to pass on the way to somewhere else. No echoes of rebellion, no pages nailed in defiance, just old wood and older silence. They say a storm was supposed to start here, that a man named Martin, thick with conscience and fury, once stood at this very threshold and struck the first blow with a hammer, not at stone, but at certainty. But in this world, he never does. No theses, no challenge, no revolution in Latin, German, or any tongue that dares bite the hand of Rome. Because the world never broke enough to give him reason. The church is still whole and heavy. It hums with gold and incense fattened by centuries of unchallenged rule. No Black Death ever came to crack its walls or steal its choirs. The priests still speak above the people, not to them. And why not? The people still listen, or pretend to, or dare not do otherwise. I heard whispers of Luther once, a monk with restless eyes. He wrote things, small things, letters, complaints, questions. But they stayed in the hands of bishops who laughed them off or burned them before they reached a congregation. Without printing presses flooding towns with paper ammunition, without a hunger for new voices or a world already cracked by death and doubt, he was just another scholar mumbling into parchment. And indulgences. Oh, they still sell those. Fat little scrolls for sale beside relics of doubtful origin. Pay and be pardoned. It works. No one asks why. The money flows, and heaven remains behind a velvet rope. In my world, the Reformation is just a possibility that never grows teeth, a fire that never catches. There's no Calvin, no Zwingli, no Protestant hymnals swelling in smoky taverns. No scriptures read aloud by farm girls who suddenly understand Latin has no monopoly on God. No England breaking free in a royal tantrum. No pilgrims packing fear into ships. No America cradling rebellion in pulpits before it ever picks up a musket. All of it, gone. And I wonder sometimes what Luther might have written if he'd felt the hunger. If the world had cracked just wide enough for his voice to echo. If he'd seen the rot and dared to call it what it was. Would he have climbed those steps, eyes blazing, and driven steel through dogma? Would he have found the hammer in his hand? But no. In this world, he dies a monk. Not a heretic, not a prophet. Just another servant of silence. And that door, it stays closed. Not because it's locked, but because no one ever thought to knock. I smelled her before I saw her. Burnt linen, charred flesh, something sweet under the horror, like roasted fruit left too long on an iron grate. The crowd was quiet for once. Not out of respect, no, out of anticipation. The kind of hush people hold when they know pain is coming, and they're not sure whether they'll flinch or enjoy it. She was young, maybe 20. Hair like mine, a little limp from the damp. They tied her hands with care as if tenderness could soften the fire. Her face? It wasn't terror I saw, it was defiance. That's what made them angrier. The Inquisition had never left us. Why would it? The plague never came to distract the church. No Black Death to humble the high. No priests collapsing beside their flock. No confession lines stretching into graveyards. No crack in God's silence that let people question who'd built the cathedral in the first place. Instead, the fires kept burning. Heresy never lost its sting. The church remained sharp-edged and vigilant, a shepherd with blood on its staff. When faith is power, and power is unquestioned, fear becomes policy. So they kept finding enemies. Women who knew too many herbs, men who dreamed in languages not sanctioned by Rome, families who whispered their own prayers after dark. I knew one, a friend. She spoke of stars like they mattered. She said maybe God liked questions. That was enough. They took her at dawn. Inquisitors weren't monsters. That's the lie we like to tell. They were meticulous, measured. They believed what they did was holy, that pain purifies, that confession saves. So they asked. Gently at first, then with tools, and when the answers weren't holy enough, they lit the kindling. In my world, the Enlightenment never rose. There was no flood of printed books to dilute fear with knowledge, no tide of reason to pull us from the shore of superstition. Galileo never tilted the heavens. Voltaire never sharpened his tongue. Nobody said, I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend your right to say it. Because nobody dared say anything. And the fire? It wasn't just for heretics, it was for thinkers, for feelers, for anyone whose truth didn't fit between Latin lines and gold-plated walls. I watched the flames reach her skirt. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something. But fear is a tight collar, and mine was cinched. So I stayed. I watched. I let the smoke teach me how silence tastes. She didn't beg. That somehow was worse. They say the fire cleanses. I say it cauterizes the future. Because every scream that echoed into ash was a voice that might have changed everything. And we let it burn. I think about them sometimes. These ghosts of thought, unborn and unremembered. The books they never wrote. Not the ones bound in gilded leather or shelved in grand libraries. No, I mean the ones scrawled in cheap ink on rough parchment passed from hand to trembling hand, dangerous only because they dared to think aloud. Books with titles no one will ever know, written by minds that never lived long enough to argue with the world. There was a girl in Avignon, they say, daughter of a candle maker. She listened more than she spoke. By 12, she could recite Aristotle better than her priest. Her father taught her how to write when the shop was empty. At night, she scribbled questions under her blanket. What if God was curious, not cruel? What if suffering wasn't sacred? But no plague came to sweep away the structures that made her voiceless. So she married at 14. Died in childbirth at 15. Her mind buried beneath someone else's name. And there was a boy near Florence, born with hands meant for ink. He watched birds in flight and saw the math behind their grace. Might have drawn flying machines in the margins of his chores. Might have dissected pigs to learn the shape of the soul. Might have written what Leonardo did, if he'd ever been allowed a teacher who believed in anything but obedience. But there were too many mouths at home. Too little mercy. He was apprenticed to a butcher. Bled out at 17 from a slip of the knife. Dozens like them. Hundreds. Minds never sparked because no crisis forced the world to loosen its grip. No plague to crumble monasteries, to rip open silence, to let rebellion breathe. Without the Black Death, the old ways didn't break. They hardened. And with them, the narrow tunnels through which talent could travel. I imagine a woman in Prague, grown old with books. She's no one's wife, no one's mother, just a scholar, writing on the soul's machinery, on plants that sing, on stars that speak in colour. Her quill scratches late into the night. Pages pile. Ideas bloom. But she doesn't exist. She couldn't. In this world, minds are still sorted by birth, not by brilliance. And brilliance, when it flares in the wrong body, in the poor, the female, the foreign, is smothered before it can catch. We never got their questions, never heard their laughter, never felt the small tremors of truth they might have unleashed. All we have are the books that did get written, the ones that told us to obey, to kneel, to fear. But sometimes I sit by the fire and listen, to the wind rattling the shutters, to the crackle of the logs, and I pretend it's them, murmuring from some other world, one where plague cracked open the sky just wide enough for light to pour in. Books they never wrote. But maybe, just maybe, they were trying. I still remember the first time I saw a Bible. Not read it, saw it. It was chained to the pulpit like a prisoner. Thick, dust-heavy, its leather cracked with age and ceremony. The priest turned its pages like they were relics, sacred not for what they said, but because no one could understand them. The words, the truth, the salvation, it all lived in Latin. And Latin didn't live in us. We listened like cattle listen to thunder. Heads down, mouths shut, hoping the storm would pass without singeing us. And maybe, if we nodded in rhythm, we'd be counted among the saved. But no one taught us to read. Why would they? Knowledge was dangerous. Understanding was treason. If you could read the words, you might start asking what they meant. Worse, you might start asking why someone else got to say what they meant. Without the Black Death, there was no breach, no rupture in the Church's dominion, no shuffling of the old order. In my world, the priests never died by the thousands. The monasteries never emptied. The grip never loosened. And so the word of God stayed locked in a tongue none of us spoke, guarded like treasure behind an altar of fear. Every prayer I knew by rote, muttered syllables with no shape, not sentences, sounds, and I whispered them like spells, hoping one of them might land where it was supposed to. I didn't know what I was saying, just that I had to say it, that maybe silence would damn me faster. The poets never wrote for us. The philosophers never translated their thoughts into our language. The stories, those luminous, impossible stories, never left the Latin tongue to walk barefoot in the fields where we worked. There was no Chaucer laughing in English, no Dante blazing in Italian, only cloistered men writing for each other, preserving a world we could never enter. And the children, my God, the children, eyes wide, eager, bursting with questions, and all we could give them was obedience. Memorize, recite, do not ask. The alphabet was a ladder we were never allowed to climb, and so our mouths grew heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Sometimes I think of what might have been. A girl in the countryside reading a poem aloud by firelight. A boy writing his first letter to his mother in words he chose himself. A village where the walls are scratched with dreams in 100 different hands. But in this world, the walls are blank. The dreams stay quiet. And the language, still Latin, rings out each Sunday, beautiful and dead, like flowers carved in stone. We never owned the words, so we never told our story. They say history moves when the ground beneath it cracks, but in my world the ground held, too firm, too quiet. I stood on the streets of Paris once, long before the dream of liberty ever flickered. The air was thick with the scent of bread no one could afford, and the perfume of women who weren't allowed to speak above a whisper. The carriages of nobles rattled by, gilded and cruel. We stood in their shadow, shoeless, voiceless, and infinitely replaceable. And we believed that was the order of things. Without the plague, the system never buckled. There was no sudden death sweeping through palaces and hovels alike, no fields left fallow, no labour shortages forcing the hand of the mighty. The lords kept their workers, and the crown kept its gold. The people kept dying quietly, on time, in line, with no dramatic exit, just slow starvation and dull obedience. There was never that pressure, the kind that builds when half a continent falls silent, and the survivors start asking why. There were no mass graves to level the illusion of divine right, no cities on their knees, no sermons about God's wrath to sour into questions about God's will. So we waited, and waited, and waited. The philosophers still wrote, sure, but not with fire, no Voltaire with his blade-sharp tongue, no Rousseau thundering about chains. The salons remained polite, the pamphlets censored, the people unlit. In 1789, nothing happened. The Bastille stood, its keys untouched, its cells full of debtors and dissenters and dreams. There were no women marching on Versailles, soaked in rain and fury. No guillotine rising in the square. No Marseillaise screamed into the night by barefoot revolutionaries. No republic, no rights, no roar. France never found its frenzy. The monarchy endured, bloated and blind, staggering forward on the backs of the poor. They called it stability. They called it peace. But it was only the absence of rupture. And we kept our heads, yes, but we lost everything else. There is a kind of violence in silence, the violence of what never gets said, never gets heard, never gets changed. In this world, the streets of Paris remained narrow. The gutters stayed red with wine and not blood, and the people still bowed, first to the priests, then to the crown, and finally to their own fading hope. No revolution meant no reset, no declaration, no rebirth. We were spared the blade, but we were never free. I watched a king once, fat with ceremony, draped in a robe so heavy it needed 2 boys to carry the train. He didn't walk so much as glide, lifted by gold and titles and the unearned prayers of 100 trembling mouths. He smiled like the sun had chosen him personally, and maybe it had. In our world it never stopped shining on the crown. Without the plague, the throne never cracked. Not once. No whispered doubts in the court, no mass death to remind the nobles they bled like the rest of us. The monarchies grew, not wiser, but wider. Generation after generation layered more silk, more silver, more sanctity atop ancient names that hadn't earned anything in centuries. The weight of it all should have crushed them. Instead, it crushed everyone else. I was born under a crest I'd never touch. My taxes paid for wars I'd never see. My life, my entire bloodline, was a breadcrumb in the feast of kings. The palace grew taller while the village roofs sagged. Every year more portraits lined the gilded halls. Every year the crown sat heavier on heads too soft to carry it. There were no revolts, not like the ones we imagined. No mobs storming gates. No sons of blacksmiths daring to speak like equals. We had no leverage, no labour shortage, no black-robed death to sweep away the old and make room for the new. The world never reset. It calcified. The kings grew old on honeyed words and spiced meat, their gout hidden behind velvet drapes. They issued edicts about grain from behind diamond rings, never once touching the dirt. They married cousins and mistresses and arranged treaties in ink, not empathy. And we bowed, and we paid, and we told our children not to dream so loud. You could see it in the parades, the endless gold wheels, the powdered wigs, the practiced waves. Monarchs paraded not to be loved but to be seen, as if their mere presence was miracle enough. And maybe it was. In a world untouched by catastrophe, they never had to prove anything. The Black Death never tore the curtain down. There was no moment of reckoning, no confrontation between God's wrath and man's rule. So they ruled longer, firmer, stupider, and we bent further. Because in a kingdom where death never came for the king, it always came for someone else. Sometimes I wonder what it would have felt like to see a crown fall, to hear a tyrant plead, to feel history shift beneath my bare feet and know that just maybe we'd won something. But in this world, the crown never falls. It just grows heavier and heavier until it flattens everything beneath it. I walked past the Bastille once. Stone walls thick as memory, shadows pooled in its corners like secrets left to rot. No fire in the windows, no chants in the streets. Just the quiet hum of resignation, the kind that sinks into the bone and tells you, this is how it's always been, and always will be. No July uprising. No mob with muskets and pitchforks. No flags painted with desperation and ash. The doors never broke open. The prisoners never emerged into daylight, blinking at freedom like it was a stranger. The Bastille never fell. It just stood there, grey, looming, perfectly indifferent. The people never rose. Why would they? There was no spark, no scarcity so brutal it turned hunger into heat. No plague to shatter the order, to remind us that kings die too. No decades of trauma compressed into a single screaming day. Without the Black Death, the pressure never built. We had our bread, barely. We had our homes, crumbling. But we also had enough fear to keep our heads bowed and our fists unclenched. The philosophers still whispered behind heavy curtains. Rousseau wrote, Voltaire quipped, but their words floated above the cobblestones like dust, not fire. The salons debated ideas over wine, but no one bled for them. No one marched for them. Without desperation, liberty stayed polite and distant. So we endured. Our voices stayed low, even when the taxes bit deep. We paid, we toiled, we died, as we were told. The nobles toasted in Versailles, laughing at imagined enemies while their real ones, us, kept sowing the fields, raising the walls, birthing the children who would also bend. There were no tricolours, no storming of symbols, no guillotine raised like a promise. The instruments of monarchy stayed intact. Law, tradition, punishment. The world stayed vertical, a pyramid of privilege built on our backs. And in the dark, we learned to pray instead of shout, learned to hope in private, to mourn in silence, to envy in whispers. The world didn't explode. It exhaled, slow, long, and stifling. Sometimes I'd walk by the Bastille again just to look, to imagine. What if the people had risen? What if we'd screamed loud enough to shake the stone loose? What if liberty wasn't a rumour, but a fact? But that door never opens. The guards yawned at their posts. The chains inside rusted peacefully, and the people, myself included, just kept walking, past the fortress, past the moment that never came, past the revolution that never burned. In our world there is no fire in the Bastille, only smoke that never rises. They sent me across the sea with a Bible in one hand and a ledger in the other. They called it duty, civilization, the divine right to shape the world in our image. I called it silence, a vast, grinding silence where the screams of others never echoed back. We planted flags on shores that already had names, already had stories. We drew maps with ink still wet with arrogance, slicing through land, language, and life. There were no questions, only orders. The empire expanded like breath held too long, slow, swollen, certain. But something was missing. The mirror never cracked. Because the plague never came, we never saw our own bones, never tasted our own fragility. Death stayed distant, not intimate, not leveling. The machine kept moving, untouched by guilt, untouched by grief. In this world, we never paused to ask why we deserved dominion, only how fast we could take it. And take we did. We sent governors in powdered wigs to rule people they never spoke to. We taught them our catechisms, our coinage, our curses. We extracted spices, silver, souls, and called it progress. We did not ask how it felt to be conquered. We did not ask if our gods were welcome. We never had to, because no collapse had humbled us. No Black Death had turned priest to corpse, lord to memory, and peasant to questioner. No half-empty cities to whisper, maybe our world is built on sand. Maybe God is not who we think. Without that reckoning, our colonies were not cautions. They were playgrounds for empire. We built cathedrals over bones, railways over rivers that once ran with names we refused to pronounce. We told stories of taming savages, not seeing them. The Enlightenment came, but only for us. It lit up lecture halls in London, not the huts we'd burned in Bengal. In the world, you know, conscience caught up eventually, in pamphlets, in paintings, in revolts, in the sick horror of seeing photographs of what was done in our name. But here, without the rot that revealed our own mortality, that conscience never arrives. There are no abolitionists in parlours arguing with red-faced lords, no revolutionaries quoting Rousseau in native tongues. There is only the dull rhythm of empire's boots on foreign soil, and the quiet nodding of those who think it will never come for them. Sometimes I wonder if the land remembers what we forgot, if the trees we felled wept when we left no marker for the names we erased. I served the empire, I believed in it, but not once did I ask why we had the right, because no death had made me humble. The plague never came, so the soul of the empire never stirred. Only the boots marched, and the silence held. The map on my wall still puts Europe at the centre, not by accident, not by scale, by design. Every line, every border, every name flows outward from Paris, London, Rome. The world doesn't radiate with connection. It spirals out from us, as if the sun rises in the Thames and sets in the Tiber. We never stopped believing that. When the Black Death never came, neither did the reckoning. No purge of the old gods. No need to rebuild broken cities or rethink who we were. We stayed the centre by default, not by virtue. Our ideas still circled in cathedrals and coffee houses. Our languages were taught, never learned. Our books were read, not translated. We assumed history would always be written in our ink. The rest of the world, distant, decorative, a backdrop to our triumphs or tragedies. China was porcelain. Africa was spice. The Americas, a myth barely drawn. We traded with them, fought them, colonized them. But we never really saw them, not as equals, not as voices. In your world, the plague broke that illusion. Europe's collapse opened space for others to rise. Trade paths shifted. New sciences bloomed in Istanbul, in Kyoto, in Timbuktu. Perspectives cracked open. Pain bred curiosity. And from the ashes of medieval arrogance came humility, and a new map, even if imperfect. But here, the lines never redrew themselves. We never lost control of the story, because we never lost anything worth questioning. The Renaissance came, but it stayed a European mirror, painting white gods with Roman noses. The Enlightenment stayed locked in salons with powdered wigs and French cigars. We talked about man and meant ourselves. We wrote human and meant Christian. No revolution came to force our eyes outward. The rest of the world remained shadowed, lit only when we chose to shine the light. I once stood in a Moroccan square, the air heavy with incense and chanting. I remember the feeling, not awe but ownership. I didn't see the culture, I saw the photo opportunity. The spice market, not the history. The colours, not the people. They were exotic because we were the baseline, the measure, the centre. It's not hatred that holds the world in orbit around Europe. It's inertia. It's what happens when power is never questioned, because death never knocked on every door equally, when maps never had to be redrawn because nothing ever burned. Sometimes I think of the continents left quiet in our textbooks, of languages buried beneath Latin, of knowledge lost not to time, but to disinterest. Europe remained the centre. And the world? It circled politely, unseen, unheard, its heartbeat drowned out by the echo of our own voice. I used to stare at the sky and think it was still, unmoving, eternal. That's what they told me. That's what the church whispered every Sunday, and every classroom echoed without pause. The stars were fixed. The earth did not move. And to question it was to question God himself, and no one dared. In your world there came a time when the heavens shifted, when a telescope pointed upward and refused to lie, when Galileo stood before judges and said, "No, the earth spins," when Newton sat under an apple tree and found gravity not in the fall, but in the formula. In your world the sky opened. In mine, it stayed shut, because the plague never came. The minds that might have been cracked open by catastrophe never were. No cities emptied, no priests silenced, no power vacuum where questions could slip through unnoticed. The hierarchy held. The dogma remained airtight. Certainty was safer than curiosity. And so the great minds stayed silent, or were never born. There is no Newton here, no Principia Mathematica, no laws of motion, no calculus spinning the clockwork universe into being. The apple fell, but no one noticed. No one wondered why. The fall was just a fall, divine will, not a force. Gravity stayed a rumour, no Galileo either. No moon with scars, no sunspots, no Venus in phases betraying the lie. The telescope still exists, but it's a toy for noblemen to admire distant lights, not a weapon against the sacred order. The stars remain perfect, eternal, distant, untouched. And with them, so does our thinking. Science is a whisper, not a shout. A candle hidden under robes. Scholars still study Aristotle as if he were scripture. The body is a balance of humours. The sky, a sphere of divine spheres. To ask otherwise is not heresy. It's madness. Dangerous, disloyal. I once met a man who tried, a mathematician in Florence. He'd charted the motion of the planets for years, noticed a wobble in the heavens. He wrote it down, carefully, quietly. Then he disappeared. His notes burned, his name forbidden. The stars don't move here, the church made sure of it, and so we live under a dome, not a cosmos. We pray to a sky we refuse to understand. Ships still navigate by stars whose stories we never updated. Time is still God's rhythm, not the ticking of celestial clocks. I can't explain what it feels like to know the world is wrong and have no words to prove it. To see the moon and know it's flawed and be told you're the one who is. No Newton, no Galileo, no sky, just the illusion of eternity, unquestioned, unmoving, and cruelly complete. I remember the first time I touched a steam engine, or rather, what passed for one in our world. A wheezing, clattering monstrosity in a nobleman's workshop, tucked behind velvet ropes and a Latin placard no one bothered to read. It looked more like a toy than a machine. It was a toy, an expensive curiosity, a miracle that never mattered. In your world, the steam boiled, in mines, in factories, in cities bursting with smoke and soot and furious invention. The pressure built until it couldn't be ignored. Gears turned, rails stretched, empires industrialized. The world shifted on pistons and steel. In mine, the water never quite gets hot enough. We have the ingredients, the coal, the iron, even the science here and there, but no spark, no reason to push the boundaries of muscle and wind. Labour is cheap, still feudal, still endless, still obedient. Why build a machine when you already own the hands? Why replace the mule when peasants still plough for scraps? The thinkers exist. I've met them. Men who sketch engines on parchment and dream of pressure and power. But their dreams stay locked in notebooks, whispered between sips of wine in universities that teach tradition, not disruption. They're not called visionaries. They're called eccentrics. Gentle mockery cushions the blow of disregard. Factories remain rare. Textiles are still woven in cottages, not mills. Roads are muddy veins, not iron arteries. Rivers are the fastest we can move. The horse is still king. And time still drags. Your world ran. Ours limps. There was no urban flood. No factory towns rising like steel skeletons. No children coughing in coal dust while mothers fed looms that never slept. No unions. No strikes. No age of machines grinding gods into rust. There is no Manchester here. No Pittsburgh. No Tokyo with smoke on its breath and ambition in its teeth. Our cities are still medieval in their bones. Narrow, dark, and slow. The lights flicker with oil, not electricity. The nights are quiet, not the hush of peace, but the silence of stagnation. The kind of stillness that grows around rot. I think sometimes about the whistle of a train. I've heard recordings, old scratches from worlds that never were. That long, low cry of something coming, something massive. I imagine what it would have felt like to stand beside a rail line for the first time. The ground trembling beneath your boots, the wind pushed ahead by progress. In this world, we never hear that sound. The steam never boils. The future stays cold. The city stinks, not in some poetic, nostalgic way, not the musk of progress or the perfume of industry. Just rot. Old fish, human waste, damp stone, and desperation baked into the walls. You walk with your mouth half covered, not because of disease, but because of the closeness, the sheer, suffocating density of people who've nowhere else to go. In your world, cities grew because they had to. People flooded into them for work, for factories, for something new. The chaos came with a promise. Hardship now, transformation later. Eventually, the filth gave way to sewers, the gas lamps to bulbs, the smoke to skylines. In mine, the filth stayed. Because the plague never came. We never burned the old cities down to their bones. No mass death meant no mass rebuilding. Streets that should have been widened stayed narrow. Walls that should have crumbled under the weight of corpses still hold firm, crowding in everyone who didn't die. And there are so many of us. Without that great thinning, without that monstrous culling, the population ballooned. Not fast, but steadily. Generations layered on top of each other like damp clothes in a chest. Great-grandparents still alive in the corner bed. Children born into corners already taken. We're not a family. We're sediment. I grew up in a house that was once a bakery. You could still smell the bread in the floorboards if the air was warm enough. But by the time I was old enough to notice, the ovens had long since gone cold. The room was carved into 3 sleeping spaces with cloth partitions. We were 11 people. We ate in shifts. We defecated in pots and tossed them into alleys. We prayed for rain to wash it all downhill. You don't grow up dreaming in a city like that. You survive. There's work, of course. Always someone needing a back bent, a bucket carried, a rug beaten. But it's the same work your father did, and his, and his. No new trades, no rising class, just generations of hands doing the same thing, just slower each year. There are markets, carts groaning under spoiled apples and half-skinned rabbits. There's noise too, the kind of noise that doesn't build, it strangles. No trains, no electricity. Just the endless mutter of thousands packed into stone bowls, each hoping to hear something new and finding only echoes. Urbanization came, but not innovation. We gathered but didn't grow. We built up, but not forward. No skyscrapers, no elevators, just more of the same. More soot, more cries, more shoulders in your space. We came to the cities chasing hope. But hope needs air, and in these cities, there is none. The first time I saw the battlefield, I expected silence, reverence, something holy. That's how the stories told it. War, they said, was a necessary evil, a matter of honor, of territory, of kings settling debts with blood. What they never mentioned was the smell and how it clung. The bodies don't just fall in war, they stack, not in neat rows, not like the drawings in the holy books where the martyrs lie like sleeping saints. No, they sprawl, they bloat, they burst, and the flies come before the priests. Always, in your world, wars reshaped nations, but they were tempered by memory. Memory of plagues, of fragility, of how fast everything could vanish. That fear of sudden, senseless death put reins on ambition. It whispered in the ear of empires, "You too can fall apart." We never heard that whisper. Because the Black Death never came, we never learned restraint. Death was still something that happened in battle, in childbirth, in bed with age. It had rules. It could be bargained with, dodged, earned. So when tensions rose, we didn't pause. We charged. The first great war I remember wasn't over land, or religion, or even gold. It was about pride. A noble slighted another in court, and suddenly banners were unfurled, swords blessed, horses fed for slaughter. Thousands marched, thousands died, and nothing changed, except the way we looked at each other. See, without the plague, we never purged the rot inside our systems. Feudalism endured, not just out of tradition, but momentum. The nobles still ruled, the peasants still bent, the church still decided. But as cities grew, as mouths multiplied and space vanished, resentment simmered. Not revolution, just resentment. And resentment, when it isn't allowed to scream, will eventually pick up a sword. We didn't fight because we feared dying. We fought because we feared changing. Every time a new idea sparked, an engineer with a strange machine, a writer questioning the chain of being, it was drowned in war. Wars we pretended were about borders, but were really about control. About keeping the world the same. Keeping the old powers on their thrones. Keeping serfs in their mud and priests in their marble. Innovation became treason. Progress, heresy. The wars kept coming, not to protect lives, but to protect lies. I watched men die with their hands still gripping their flags, their stomachs opened by steel, but their eyes full of confusion, as if they expected the world to reward their loyalty. But the world didn't change. The lords redrew some lines, the bishops held new masses, and the rest of us, those who survived, went back to our cramped streets, stepping over mud and bones and memory. The plague never came to cleanse us, so we cleansed each other, and still the filth remained. There are nights I lie awake, not because I'm in pain, but because I'm not. And that's when it hits me. We never bled. Not like you did. We never wept into mass graves or lit candles for a third of the world. We never watched cities fall quiet from grief, only from overcrowding. We were never broken. And because of that, we never healed. There's a kind of clarity that only comes after catastrophe. A sobering stillness when the screaming stops. A re-evaluation of life, of death, of meaning. But in my world, that moment never came. The darkness never arrived. So we never had to crawl our way toward the light. You, your ancestors, had to reckon with horror. You had to look God in the eye and ask why. You had to find science when prayers failed. You had to invent sanitation, isolation, reform, not out of ambition but out of necessity. Your suffering made your world better. Ours just made ours louder. Because without the devastation, we never questioned our systems. The nobles kept their tax ledgers fat. The priests kept their congregations fearful. The poor stayed poor. And the machine just kept turning, grinding bones instead of gears. We called it order. We mistook survival for success. When I was a child, I remember watching an eclipse. Everyone gathered in the square, faces tilted skyward. It was one of the few times our city fell quiet. As the light dimmed and the birds fell silent, something stirred in me, something ancient. I didn't know it then, but I think I was feeling loss, not of the sun, but of what might have been. Because now I look at your world, the world that clawed its way from plague pits to penicillin, and I envy it. Not the suffering, never that, but the transformation. You endured the darkness, and you built cathedrals of light from it. You questioned, you challenged, you changed. In my world, there's no enlightenment because there was no fire to see by. No renaissance because we never had to rebuild. No revolutions because we never hit bottom. Just a long, unbroken continuation of what was. What always was. A shadowless, stagnant dusk. And now older, I long for the dark. I long for the rupture, the reckoning, the reason to evolve. Because this endless twilight has made everything dull, even joy, even sorrow. There's no contrast, no urgency, just motion, just noise. Sometimes I wonder what kind of person I'd be if the plague had come. If the world had ended and forced us to begin again. Would I be gentler? Would I listen more? Would I have found something sacred in survival? But the ships never docked. The bells never tolled. The darkness never fell. And so the light never meant anything. I used to believe we were the lucky ones. No plague carts rolling through our streets. No bodies stacked like firewood. No moans echoing from behind bolted doors. We kept our dead where they belonged, in manageable numbers, with time for prayers, for rituals. The horror that visited your world skipped ours entirely. We thanked God for that, for sparing us, for keeping the rot across the sea. But I've lived long enough to know that mercy can sometimes be a curse in disguise. Because the plague, your plague, was a terrible teacher, unforgiving, brutal, cruel. It slaughtered without reason, without regard for title or faith. It didn't care who you were. It only cared that you breathed. And in its wake, it left a classroom no one volunteered to enter, but from which you all emerged. Changed. You learned, didn't you? You learned that death could touch anyone, so life had to mean something. You questioned why some lived in marble halls while others starved in gutters. You asked why the church's prayers failed, and whether there might be a better truth than blind obedience. You discovered that blood could be studied, not just spilled. That the human body wasn't a vessel for sin, but a system, a miracle of bone and breath and mystery. It forced you to challenge, to think, to rebel, to rebuild. And us, we were never forced, so we never moved. No one asked questions because no one had to. The world remained intact. The lords stayed seated. The monks kept chanting, and the peasants bent their backs like nothing had happened, because nothing had. Medicine stayed medieval. Ideas stayed caged. Curiosity stayed dangerous. And we called it peace. But peace without progress is a prison. Now, when I walk through the city, I see the signs of our contentment. The same towers, the same markets, the same sermons echoing from the pulpits. Centuries of sameness, fossilized in stone and law. We avoided the plague, yes, but we also avoided the mirror it forced you to look into, the reflection of who we were and who we might become. You didn't survive because you were stronger. You survived because you adapted, because you had no choice. And in that crucible you forged the tools of a better world. Science, rights, revolutions. You planted seeds in the ashes. We were never burned, so nothing grew. There is no teacher crueler than death. But there may be none wiser either. You learned that. We didn't. And now, I wonder if the real curse was survival without struggle, a life uninterrupted, a history unchanged. Because without the pain, without the fire, without the funerals stacked high enough to blot out the sun, we never learned a damn thing. And so we keep breathing, but never living. We had time. That was the lie. Time to plan, to pray, to perfect. Time to build slow and steady toward a future that never came. Because when death didn't knock at the door, we assumed we were safe, eternal, unchanging. We believed that without desperation, progress would simply arrive. Calm, polite, and inevitable. But that's not how it works. Progress, real progress, doesn't come gently. It comes screaming, clawing, desperate to survive. It's not born from comfort. It's born from collapse. Your world bled and then bloomed. Ours just lingered. Because in our version of history, the pressure never came. The cities stayed full. The lord stayed fat. And the people stayed bowed. There were no gaps to fill. No systems to question. No sudden need to reimagine what medicine could be. Or who should own land. Or why a peasant's life was worth less than a priest's prayer. Without the plague to strip it all bare, the scaffolding of our old world stayed upright, rotting slowly behind a facade of order. And so did we. No doctors dissecting cadavers in secret. No humanists scribbling heresies in candlelit rooms. No Gutenberg racing to spread thought faster than silence. Because the silence had never screamed. The world never crumbled beneath us. There was no fire to flee, no mountain of bodies to make us ask why. I once heard someone say catastrophe clears the table. Ours never was. The same meal kept being served. Stale bread, spoiled wine, and sermons carved from dust. The hunger never sharpened us. We stayed soft, dull, and full. I used to envy you, your survivors, your broken world, stitched together with revolutions and revelations. Now I envy your scars, because scars mean healing. They mean something happened, something ended, and something else began. We have no such marks, just centuries of smooth skin stretched over brittle bones. No renaissance, no enlightenment, just more of the same echoing through time like a song that never modulates. And still, we call it peace. But peace isn't progress. It's just quiet decay. And without desperation to ignite the mind and rupture the old order, we never dreamed. Not really. We had no reason to. You had to. That's why you left us behind. You didn't rise because you were smarter, or braver, or better. You rose because you were crushed. And in that weight, you found the will to lift the future. Not for comfort, not for kings, but for survival. That's what we never understood. And now it's too late. I used to believe we were the lucky ones. We didn't bury half our families in shallow graves. We didn't light pyres that burned for weeks. We didn't hear the streets of Florence go quiet or see the Thames choke on corpses. Our hands stayed clean. Our prayers stayed safe. Our world stayed whole. But now I wonder if wholeness was the wound. Because in your world, the one split open by plague, you were forced to rebuild. And what rose from the ashes was jagged, strange, defiant. You got the microscope, the manifesto, the man who said, "What if the sun doesn't move?" You got rebellion, revolution, art that bled and pulsed with soul. You got medicine with answers. We got incense and leeches. We got quiet. See, when you've never been broken, you don't learn how to fight for shape. You don't get to choose who you become. You just become whatever kept you from falling apart. In our world, that meant obedience, structure, the slow suffocation of tradition reinforced by the absence of trauma. We kept going because nothing stopped us. But nothing challenged us either. Your world, was forged in fire. A fire no one wanted, no one deserved, but fire all the same. It stripped you. It humbled you. It forced you to look inward and upward and ask why. Why this body? Why this God? Why this system? Why not something better? We never asked. Because we never had to. I've watched generations die of ignorance in clean beds, surrounded by false certainty. No microscope ever touched our plague-free flesh. No anatomy textbook ever cracked our sacred taboos. We kept bleeding people who only needed rest. Kept praying over children with fevers as if Latin would reverse infection. Because our world didn't have to get smarter to survive. It was never on fire. You learned. We endured. And now I can't help but wonder, what if loss is the price of growth? What if suffering isn't the enemy of progress, but its parent? What if tragedy isn't something to be avoided but transformed? It's a dangerous thought, one I would have banished once, But now, I look at your world and I see what pain made possible. Your libraries, your clinics, your questions. And I look at mine, untouched and unbroken, and I see what safety preserved. The silence. We thought we were spared. But maybe we were only stalled, because what didn't kill us didn't make us stronger. It just kept us asleep. It happened slowly, like thaw. At first it was just a feeling, a thin crack in the plaster of everything I'd ever trusted. I couldn't name it, not then. Just an unease, like the world around me was too quiet, too clean, like I'd inherited a history too well behaved to be real. I was taught to be grateful, to thank the saints for our survival, for our uninterrupted line of kings, for cities that never burned and doctors who never changed. I learned the names of holy men and memorized verses from books that hadn't updated in centuries. I believed progress was a kind of heresy, but then I started to wonder why nothing ever felt new. And that's when it began. Not a revolt, not a revelation, just curiosity. The dangerous kind, the kind that peels back wallpaper in a house and finds brick beneath. I asked questions I'd never heard asked. Why did we still trust the same medicine that killed more than it cured? Why did our teachers quote Galen like he'd written yesterday's news? Why did we still whisper about the body like it was a sin? Why did no one ask why? And once that door opened, I couldn't shut it again. I began reading what I wasn't supposed to, listening harder, watching the edges, and in those edges I saw what had never come. The spark, the fracture, the fire. I saw your world in glimpses, a timeline rewritten by disease, yes, but also by response. You were wounded and you evolved. We were spared and we stagnated. It hit me one night staring at a cathedral so perfectly preserved it felt embalmed. We were never saved. We were stored, kept like artifacts, like memories of a past too sacred to let go. No one ever forced us to rethink who we were, and so we didn't. But I am now. I can't unknow what I know. That tragedy, as cruel as it is, has teeth that carve open truth. That fire clears space for new growth. That pain, when faced, can turn into power. I'm awake in a time that didn't want me to be, and the air feels colder, sharper, realer. I walk streets paved by men who never needed to change. But I look for the cracks, for the places where light still leaks through. I seek out others who are stirring, quiet thinkers, painters with strange visions, healers who dare to ask questions. We are few, but we are not no one. I don't know what I'll become in this world that never fell, but I do know this. I've stopped wishing we were lucky, because now I see the cost of never bleeding, and I've decided that even in a world untouched by plague, I will not stay clean. I will dig. I will disrupt. I will wake up, fully, finally, in my own time.